here this morning. We will go to Genesis chapter 35. Just a while earlier, Rachel gives birth to Joseph. She dies during childbirth. Joseph is probably, she gives birth to Benjamin and dies. Joseph is probably around 10 years old, maybe, at this time. We're doing a lot of conjecturing here. But anyway, in chapter 35, verse 10, Jacob's name is changed to Israel. And I noticed that especially, look at verse 9. God appeared to Jacob again, and so on. And then I noticed over, let's see, where are we? Anyway, I was reading this morning, and God had changed his way that he addressed Jacob. He is now addressing him as Israel. But at this point, he still calls him Jacob. This is Genesis 35 and verse 9. Then God went up, verse 13 says, from the place where he talked with him. We don't know anything about that procedure. We were made to think, of course, of what happened at the end, about the middle of Acts chapter 1, when Christ ascended back to the Father, and he went up. But that's all we have here about God going up from that place where he had talked with Jacob. I want to start with verse 19. Rachel dies and is buried in the way to Ephrath. E-P-H-R-A-T-H. Ephrath sometimes is used interchangeably with the word Bethlehem, but I think what we're talking about here, Ephrath is more likely an area. Bethlehem is a town in that particular area. So anyway, we're made to think, and I think we were here last week when the buzzer sounded, of a prophecy that's made by Micah, in Micah chapter 5. And listen to this, starting in Micah 5 verse 2, we have a prophecy. Bethlehem Ephrathah, there it is again, together. Now this is about a few hundred years, probably about nearly 1,000 years later, by the prophet Micah, still prophesying in his future about Jesus Christ. So that's another 600 or 700 years in the future. But here's what Micah said. But thou, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, though you be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of you shall come forth unto me one that is to be the ruler in Israel. Aha! Somebody in the future is going to be ruling Israel, and that person is going to be born in Bethlehem. But this person also described as being eternal. Look at that last part. Whose goings forth have been from of old, from everlasting. That is, of course, talking about the Messiah, Jesus Christ, yet to be born some 600 years or so in the future. Fascinating when you stop to think about Psalms chapter 90, when it's talking in there about God the Father. And he is from everlasting to everlasting. Now here Jesus Christ is called everlasting. His goings forth have been from everlasting. You read from the book of John in the New Testament, verses 1 through 3, that's exactly the case. God and Christ, and certainly the Holy Spirit, are together in John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word that we read in verse 14 was talking about Christ. So in Christ was the Word, and he was with God. John 1:1. When? Of old, in the beginning. So it agrees perfectly with all that we read regarding the time element of God being eternal in nature. Okay, Rachel is buried there, not quite in the area of Bethlehem yet, but in the area of Ephrath. Jacob puts a pillar on her grave, verse 20, Genesis 35, verse 20. And this was a regular pattern, evidently. Bury them very quickly, put up a pillar as a point of setting apart the grave of Rachel. And it says it's there until this day. What day is that? Well, the writer of this book of Genesis, probably Moses' day, so that would mean this is Moses saying it's still there today. When was Moses' time? Around 1500 BC. So that's yet another 200 years in the future. So that's what he's saying. It's been here for 200 years. Okay, now Genesis 35, verse 21. Israel journeyed and spread his tent. What term would we use today, do you think? Instead of spread his tent, usually I hear or read, they pitched the tent. In other words, they set up his tent. And it came to pass that Israel, when Israel dwelt in the land, now Israel is talking about not the nation yet. He's talking about the man, Jacob. But God calls him, since he changed his name to Israel, now he is addressing him as the man, Israel. Came to pass when Israel dwelt in that land that Reuben went in and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard of it. Period. Strange place to put a period. I have a lot of questions of why did he stop right there? Just make mention of it. Gave no reason for the occasion. Doesn't tell why this went on. But nonetheless, it was a rather disgusting event that happened. The oldest son was Reuben, and he began to, he had this affair with his stepmother, Bilhah, Rachel's handmaid. Again, why? I mean, she's quite a bit older. What's going on here? Well, Reuben, he's single, we know that, but what about the concubine or Rachel's concubine, Bilhah? Why did she do this? Why would she take part in it? I don't know, but one possible reason is this. Now remember, Reuben is the oldest child. That's Leah's boy. And he's having this illegal, unlawful, unethical affair with Bilhah, who was Rachel's handmaid. Why would she go along with this? Some have suggested that after Rachel's death, and of course it's just occurred in our reading, after Rachel's death, Bilhah desired to take the place of Rachel, because she was Rachel's handmaid. She's taking the place of Rachel, possibly, in all of Jacob's attention and affection, and she probably wanted to be his favorite, maybe thinking this would help bring it about. But when Jacob learned of it, certainly he put a stop to it. We find over in Genesis 49, as Jacob talking to all of his boys right before he dies, we mentioned this last Lord's Day. Listen to this statement. He gathered his sons together, Genesis 49:1, and said, "Gather yourselves together that I may tell you what's going to happen in the last days." So, gather yourselves together and hear, you sons of Jacob, or hear me, my sons, and hearken unto Israel. He didn't say Jacob. Hearken unto Israel, your father. And he starts with the oldest boy, Reuben. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, the beginning of my strength, the excellency of dignity, and the excellency of power. All right, so good so far. But then it changes. Then he says, you are as unstable as water. Now that's quite a statement. You are unstable as water. You will not excel. Because, now notice, that's the reason why we're jumping over here to 49. We'll see it later when we get to the regular chronology of the text. But he said, because you went into your father's bed and you defiled it. So this is Jacob or Israel saying, Reuben, I didn't forget what happened between you and Bilhah. And then he talks about Simeon and Levi, and they were those two boys that were the leaders in that Shechemite. Well, it was a blitzkrieg, it was an attack, and he wiped out all of the men of the little town of Shechem. Well, that happened not too long before this. But anyway, back to Genesis 35. Now, last of verse 22, now the sons of Jacob were 12. Well, what a way to keep right on. He doesn't tell us anything more about what happened with Reuben and Bilhah. No, that's all we need to know, I guess, because that's all we have in the way of inspiration on it. This brings up another question. The sons of Leah are Reuben, the firstborn, then Simeon and Levi, then Judah and Issachar and Zebulun. Then Rachel began and gave him Joseph. This is not exactly in chronological order because it's in order of the mothers, but not in chronological order in which they were born. There were a number of others from Zilpah and Bilhah in between here, but Bilhah's are now mentioned. Zilpah in verse 29, she had Gad and Asher. These were all born when they were over in Mesopotamia in Padan Aram. So Jacob never forgot what Reuben did, his firstborn. At this point, the writer, I guess Moses, thought it was necessary to go ahead and give us an entire list of the boys, Why at this time? I don't know, but probably they're getting ready to go on over and meet with Isaac. Isaac is still alive. Rebekah has died, but Isaac is still alive, almost blind, and Jacob wants to present to Dad, his dad, your grandsons. So Isaac was going to see all his grandsons as evidence that God was fulfilling his promises that had been made. At least that's what we have next. Finally, Jacob comes home. Look at verse 27. Jacob came unto Isaac, his father, there in Hebron, where Abraham and Isaac sojourned. I would say they lived there, they did, but they let us know by using the word sojourn that it was temporary. This was not the land that God had promised, but they were in Hebron and they were sojourners there. And the days of Isaac were 180 years. Still, these lives were quite lengthy. But we already noticed how at the time of the flood, they began to decrease dramatically from 969. Now we're down to 180 years. So they're decreasing a lot each year. Verse 29, Isaac gave up the ghost. I didn't check that out. I intended to check what the Septuagint had here. Gave up the ghost. Every time I see this statement, it usually means the same thing. I assume that it's a word of ek, meaning out. We're talking about Greek here because the Septuagint was the Greek Old Testament written about 280 BC. But the word ek added on to the front of the word pneo, neo, to breathe out. He breathed out his last. Interestingly enough, the word pneuma, P-N-E-U, comes from the word meaning to breathe. And so the word spirit is translated from this word neo. Thus, see the connection? Isaac gave up the spirit. He breathed his last. Translated like you want to. We know what it means, but we have different ways of expressing that. He died and was gathered to his people, being old and full of days, and bless their hearts. Jacob and Esau have now already come together, made friends, and acting more like they ought to, because for 20 years they'd been estranged from each other. Jacob ran off at his mother's urging, Rebekah, sending him back home to Laban at Padan Aram. And she said, stay there for a few days and I'll send for you. 20 years later, finally, Jacob and Esau meet. We had that last week or week before last. Now they're friends. Now Dad dies. What happens at funerals even today? They're more or less, kind of like family reunions. I've heard a lot of people express it that way. It looks like this is the only time we get together for a family reunion, when we get together with family members. Some of them will come from great distances to be there. I don't think it's any different with these two boys, Jacob and Esau. How many times, though, have you heard of people having problems and for years? You could probably name some right now that they haven't spoken to their siblings for 10 years, maybe 15 years. They just don't get along. They have nothing to do with each other until mom or dad dies. then, or maybe on their deathbed in the hospital, and here they're facing each other for the first time. Tears begin to be shed. They're softening up. They're mellowing a little bit. I think that's what we got going on here. Jacob, or Isaac, rather, Jacob's dad died. And these two brothers, who've been at war with each other, finally, I like the way it's worded, that they buried him. So now they're together. That had to be an emotional situation, just like it is today. Now this is probably also the time when the family records, that's what we have given here. Here are the generations of Esau. We just finished Jacob's family. This would also be a very convenient time for the family records to be given from Esau to Jacob, and then included in the text that we have. I don't know any other reason as to why we would have this injected here in chapter 36, verse 1. Now, these are the generations of Esau, who's also called Edom. Why are we bringing up Esau now? Probably because of the reasons we just finished giving. Their dad had died. They were burying him. This is probably the records that Esau had been keeping. He probably gives them to Jacob. And Jacob then will include them. And I'm glad to have, at least we have this much information found about that situation. We have it here in our Bibles. So the generations of Esau were included here. Esau and Jacob, remember, each of them, back in Genesis 25 and also 35, they are 120 years old. Esau had been married for 80 years. Jacob had been married for 40 years. Which means, if you stop and think about it, Esau had an entire generation of time for kids to be born. So he's going to have a whole bunch more children than Jacob during that 40-year period. But anyway, this is a likely time that family information diaries. I mentioned last week I've got about 25 diaries that my granddad made, starting way back about 1915. And I'm glad to have them because you really get a lot of personal information there. That's the same kind of situation we have here. By the time of Moses, the descendants of Esau were known as Edomites. Why? Look at verse 1, 36, verse 1. These are the generations of Esau, who is Edom. So instead of calling them Esauites, they're called Edomites. That's a name with which you are more familiar. I want to just have a verse or two here in 7 and 8, and then I'm going to skip the rest of the chapter because it's just a bunch of names. But right now, Genesis 36, look at verse 7. Well, no, let's go back to 6. Esau took his wives, his sons, and daughters, all the persons in that house, the cattle, the beasts, all of his substance that he had got in the land of Canaan, and he left. He went to another area, and it said he went from the face of his brother Jacob. But this is not because they were not getting along. They were getting along now. They finally made peace. So what's the problem? Read on. The problem is the land wherein they were strangers. They're both were strangers, just like Dad was. The land in which they were strangers couldn't bear them because of their herds, their stock. And so Esau realized this situation is getting rather untenable, and he decided that he would be the one that leaves, and he goes to Mount Seir. Now remember, Esau is Edom, it says. So where is Mount Seir and Edom? Well, you know, in your mind's eye, you know where the Dead Sea is. You've got Galilee, and then the river, and then down into the Dead Sea. Now go south and east a little bit, and this is a mountainous area, and you are now in the country of Edom, the Edomites. Okay, one more point, because we're talking about a bunch of generations here. Esau had 5 sons, unknown number of daughters, many servants and cattle. He realized there's not room for both of us here, Jacob, so I'm going to leave. And he moves down to southeast of the Dead Sea. And notice the word foreigners that's used. Because Abraham was a foreigner, Isaac was, and so was Jacob. They're all foreigners there. In other words, strangers. Why call them that? Because they didn't have land. All they owned was maybe a cave or a small bit of land, a parcel of land to bury their relatives in. That was it. They were not landowners. What were they doing? Open land is the way that it was. It wasn't fenced. Open land, and they would graze a certain area, and then they would just move those flocks, and no doubt by this time thousands of animals from one spot to another. Well, there wasn't room for both Jacob and Esau's stock. And so Esau realized that, and he left. To his credit, so give him credit where credit is due. Then we have a bunch of children and grandchildren that are mentioned starting in verse 9 all the way to verse 39, verse 43. So I'm skipping all of that. You can look at it if you like to pronounce names. I don't care that much. So we'll go on. We're coming to a more familiar story. We've already mentioned Joseph and Benjamin. Joseph is about 10 to 12, 13 years older than Benjamin when Benjamin was born. Rachel had died when Benjamin was born, so now Joseph is a teenager, a young teenager. If you're interested in time element, which I seem to be getting more and more interested, how old was he at a certain point? Jacob and his family were dwelling near Isaac there in Hebron in Genesis 35. This part of the story of Joseph then takes place about 2 years after they had reached Hebron, and Joseph was about 17 years old. How do we know? Because of verse 2. Chapter 37, let's read verses 1 and 2. Jacob dwelt in the land wherein his father was a stranger. He was a sojourner. He didn't own land there, except that little cave I was telling you about. That was in the land of Canaan. Now here are the generations of Jacob. Joseph being, well, bless his heart, I'm glad that Moses decided to put an exact time frame. Joseph was just 17 years old. Dylan. 17 years. Dylan's already 19. Okay. That's how old Joseph is, 17 years old. He was feeding the flock with his brothers, and he was with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, those half-brothers. Where were the older boys? Well, now they're on up in years, probably in their early 20s or more. And they're given the job of being more responsible, and they would be further away. We find out here that they go on a journey. Dad sends them 2 days journey away, and they go on even another day. So that's like 70 miles away with the flock, Dad's herd. So now we pick up the story of Joseph. Here's what the New Testament says about it. I thought it was fascinating, trying to keep them in mind. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 9, here the inspired writer of Hebrews says, by faith, Abraham sojourned, lived temporarily, in the land of promise, in a strange country, in tabernacles, that means in tents, dwelt in tents, in the land of promise, and he dwelt there with Isaac and Jacob. Now that's a lot of history and geography. The heirs, who are they? They are the heirs with him of the same promise. We've been pointing that out. God said, I'm giving to you, Abraham, this land and your children forever. He renewed it to Isaac. He renewed it to Jacob. And so that's how the Hebrew writer puts it by inspiration, what I've just sort of recounted for you. They were heirs with Abraham of the same promise that was handed down from generation to generation. They all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them from afar. They were persuaded of them, and they embraced them, and they confessed that they too were sojourners and pilgrims on the earth. So sort of sums it up by inspiration of what we've been discussing for a number of months. Now the story of Joseph, with which I think you probably are much more familiar. But you ever stop and think, God never, as far as being recorded is concerned, God never spoke to Joseph directly like he did Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. At least we don't find it recorded for us in the Bible. It is true that the sons of Jacob would mean primarily Judah. Son number 4 of Leah was the one that was going to be selected, through whom the promise of the Messiah was to come 1,700 years later. Okay, now, the idea of jealousy, maybe pride, but it's surely here today. And we see that same thing rearing its ugly head in the story of Joseph. Joseph's older brothers were Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, in that order. They were men by this time, on up in years, given more responsibilities, and they were generally living away from their father. Joseph was still back home, along with his younger brother Benjamin. And Joseph liked to stay with the younger family. I think that's very natural. Young people like to be with other young people who are nearer their age. You ever notice? That's bound to be the reason why that Joseph stayed with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah. Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. They seemed to chum together. I guess it was the age factor. Probably all 5 of these boys were in the process of learning about shepherding, animal husbandry, and so they were given jobs closer to home while the older boys were in charge of the flocks further away. So now Jacob had been hearing some things. They were not good, unfavorable, about the behavior of these oldest boys. Joseph began to bring reports about the 4 sons by the 2 handmaids. He was telling Dad what he had heard was going on. Probably those reports were true. Whether or not he was wise in telling Dad about it, that's another story. You know that you don't have to repeat things just because they're true. And that's true regarding rumors. You don't know whether it's true or not, don't repeat it. Even if it is true and you are sure, does it need repeating? Joseph needed that lesson. As we'll find out, it caused him a lot of trouble. Okay, now, he decides that he's going to tell Daddy about it. We use the term tattletale today. But he does. Dad, of course, gets upset hearing about certain things going on. But he loves Joseph. And probably he shows favoritism when things were not very good among the siblings anyway. And so Dad gives a special coat to Jacob. You know that's bound to upset the other boys. Did you see what Dad gave Jacob? That coat? It's called many colors. I want to read this very quickly before the bell rings the second time. There's a Hebrew word in the Old Testament, pasim, P-A-S-S-I-M. The I-M means it's plural. It's been translated this way: colorful, embroidered, striped with pictures, suggesting that it probably was a long garment that reaches all the way down on the hands to the wrist area and to the ankles. So it was a long garment, but it was, I assume, rather gaudy. I assume that probably he wore that because he liked the garment. He may have worn that to irritate his brothers a little more, but at least that's what happened. So the one wearing that garment might be seeking to set himself apart and above the others. Look what Dad gave me. I'm a special person. At least that's the way that the other brothers accepted it or treated it. That's going to cause problems. And then he tells his dad his dreams. Now, you know, parents are glad to be having children talk to them. Sometimes when you get teenage level, they clam up. They go to their room, they keep their door shut. They don't want to talk. They've got their friends. Sometimes they go into their room with their friends and shut their door, and if they're of the opposite sex, you'll open the door and say, keep the door open, please. So They were people just with problems just like people today. Anyway, he comes and has a dream. Verse 8, he dreamed a dream. He immediately tells it to his brothers, and they hated him all the more because of it. What was that dream about? He said, well, when I dreamed last night, I had a dream, and I had my sheaves out here all lined up, and your sheaves were out here, and your sheaves bowed down to mine. Uh-oh. How's that going to be accepted? About like you would expect. I don't know whether the scripture makes this statement that this dream actually came from the Lord or not. It might have been just an expression of Jacob's own subconscious feelings of superiority over his brothers. Look, Dad gave me this coat. What did he give you? But I sort of think that probably the dream did come from the Lord because it is prophetic in nature. What happens in the future? Go to the next dream. The next night, Joseph dreams a dream, and in it, verse 9, chapter 37, verse 9, he said, I dreamed a dream, and in this dream the sun and the moon and 11 stars. Who do you think those 11 stars represent? Well, his 11 brothers. And in this dream, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars all bowed down to me. And then he tells it to his father, and of course to his brothers. And his father rebukes him for it. And says, son, what is this that you dreamed? Are you trying to tell me that your mother and I and your brothers are going to bow down to you one of these days? Well, you know what happens in the future. We'll pick up the rest of the story next week. Thanks for being here.